Okay, this is recording. So I am on the phone and I'm talking with Paul Newnes. Paul, could you just introduce yourself, please?
Yes, my name is Paul Newnes. I live in the UK. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Deducive. That's me.
Okay, so I have a number of questions which I've asked everybody and then some others which are slightly more specific to you. And so I will start. My first question to you is, can you think of something in your own field, recent or long past, that struck you as genuinely new, not just well done, genuinely new, and what was it that made it feel that way to you?
Genuinely new?
Yes. Whether it was a way of going about creating an interactive site or music or art or writing, whatever you want to think about.
I think I spend probably far too many hours in the day working. So unfortunately, so my reference is probably from work, given I sort of work 12 to 14 hours most days.
Yep.
And so if I look at the last sort of 6 to 12 months in terms of how my work has changed, then when I had an inspiration from a client around what they were doing with specifically Claude. And I thought, that's interesting. They're using it in a different way from me, and they were using it for quite deep research, but also analysis. And I've been somewhat reluctant around using sort of AI sort of chat sort of prompts to do analysis. And by analysis, I mean sort of uploading a simple data set. Let's say it's in just sort of a rectangular data within a spreadsheet, whether it's an Excel or a CSV file. Uploading that and then allowing the AI to then give you some insights from that. And so this chap had been doing that and getting some good results, and it was saving him a bit of time. And so in terms of something new for me, then I took that a stage further by having AI actually write code, either in the R programming language or Python, to do analysis of very, very, very big and complex data sets, and then produce simple summary files from there, and then feed those into Claude to then give analysis. And then progressively, I've got better at that in terms of prompting Claude to building checks so that the opportunity for hallucinations is less. So in terms of something that's genuinely new, that is a completely new way of working for me, which is to rely upon AI to I'll say what I want and describe some things around what the raw data looks like, have Claude produce the prompt for Codex to write the code with sort of guardrails that Claude's defined, and then give the summary data back to Claude for analysis. So that's something that's sort of the biggest, newest thing that's really sort of happened to me in the last year, because it's been quite transformational in terms of the way that I work. Not that it's necessarily saved any time overall, it's just allowed me to do more. So it's probably had a sort of a 5 or 10 times reduction in time, but that's just meant that I've been able to go deeper. So, sort of the amount of work has sort of expanded to fill the extra time that's been lost. But that's the biggest, newest thing.
And within the process that you developed with Claude primarily, and that Claude came back to you with, was there stuff in particular that you were genuinely surprised about the way it was doing things?
Yes, it's sort of level of understanding. I think with it, I think the anticipation of having given a half decent prompts at the very start of the chat, sort of to describe what the data was, where it had come from, what I wanted, why I wanted it, was the sort of threads of the original prompts would sort of remain throughout the analysis. when we would get to the end, then it would say, well, okay, we've now got what we think is sort of good verified data. Shall I now put this into a presentation layer and actually reference the names of my client as well? Because I would give it quite a sort of a rich sort of almost story at the start with background and context at the start of the prompting. To initialize that, and then at the end, it would even say, well, perhaps we should get it into this format as a presentation layer to summarize it and to show what the findings are. So that was pretty surprising. So it wasn't just, it's not just a black box where you sort of ask something, you get it back. There's sort of context that remains at the end in terms of in terms of its willingness to sort of help and get it into not only perform the analysis, but then to get it in the correct format for presentation to others, to other humans.
So that could be seen as Claude actually being somewhat creative there.
Well, it's certainly very helpful. I think in terms of it being creative, I think that leads me to something else, actually. My mind's a little cluttered, so it's difficult. So as I'm talking this through, there are more sort of examples that are coming to mind. So let me think now. Okay, so this is a really good example. So in April, I was presenting at a conference in Warsaw, in Poland.
Yep.
And I was presenting around what Deducive, my company, actually does. And we do data analysis, but a lot of it is proving the effectiveness of marketing or advertising and marketing, which is, that's been something that people have been trying to answer one way or another for decades.
Yep.
But now with a lot of this moving online, there are a lot of very, very bad ways to measure the efficiency of your advertising, and there are some pretty good ways, and it's around probability, not certainty. Anyway, so I wanted to. So it's quite difficult to explain all of this, and especially to an audience of people who own advertising agencies. And I had to tell them that basically the way that they were presenting all of their data to their clients was wrong, and that probably all of them knew that it was wrong, but nevertheless they still continue to present it to their clients, even though they know that it's wrong. And there is a lot of people tended to look at the floor and were sort of shaking their heads and so forth. Anyway, but with such a sort of serious subject, what I wanted to do was keep the actual presentation lighter. So what I did was to have movie references in there, and so for each sort of section of the presentation was only going to last about 20-25 minutes. I wanted to have a movie reference that was in there. And so, for instance, I had let me see, I'm trying to remember. I'd have to pull the presentation for each one, but there was a subtle theme to each of the sections. And I think there were 6 sections. I'd chosen 3 or 4 of the movie references that I thought would be sort of clever, quite subtle sort of references from the character that was presented in the scene of the movie, and then to what the subject was. And I asked Claude to then pick 2 others and said, look, I need a character that is basically sort of takes credit where it's not due. And it came back with Gaston out of Beauty and the Beast. Now, I hadn't even seen Beauty and the Beast, but I researched the character. It was absolutely spot on. And there was another one as well. So I'd asked it to, so I told it the 4 that I had, and I said I needed another 2 characters and scenes, and I need those images. And it went and found those for me. It got what I was trying to do, the subtlety of the scenario that I was trying to sort of reference through this one image from a movie, the character in the scene. and it found those other two, which I thought, and like one of them was from a film that I hadn't seen, which was Beauty and the Beast, and I didn't know the character. But like I said, as soon as I researched the character, I was like, oh my gosh, that's spot on. So to me, that's something creative. That's something that I wouldn't have figured out, and it took quite a lot of nuance to understand that was correct. So that was to go back to the previous question. That was very surprising.
I mean that's a big step forward, isn't it, compared to where we were, say, 2 years ago. I feel like you say
it's massive, yeah.
When doing research now, the level of, like you say, its understanding of where you're trying to get to, as long as you give it enough information and good prompts, is quite remarkable, isn't it?
It is, and I think for me, it's how it's what you give it in terms of context, right? And for me, and I don't know how true this is in terms of how the actual AI works, because obviously these are very, very, very sort of complex black boxes. But the underlying technology in terms of machine learning, which I do understand a little bit, for me, that's all about the training data, right? So I'm using that sort of, I've stuck to using that approach in terms of how I ask AI for anything, which is, well, I need to give it context because I'm kind of retraining it. Now, I don't know to what degree that's actually true with sort of complex LLMs and whatever. I don't know. But I've sort of, so far, I've kept that as sort of an operating principle to how I ask questions. So, for instance, if I'm going to ask it to write some code, then I've got quite a lot of code before, so I'll tell it where to look at for some prior code examples, what to do and so forth. So, I think the more context that you give it, you should be prepared to be more surprised because the sort of the outputs are like, wow, I wouldn't have thought of that. So the more context you give it, the better the outcome, not just in terms of accuracy, but also I would say what would pass as creativity.
So you said something a bit interesting there. I think what I heard you say was that the more context you give it, it's almost as though for that instance of it, you're retraining it.
Yeah. That's my mental model around it. As I said, I don't know how true that is in terms of how LLMs work, right?
Yeah.
It's not truly training data. But certainly that's my mental model of having worked with machine learning to do sort of statistical analyses and so forth. Then that's my sort of mental model that I go in. So
I think that's a really interesting insight. That within that instance, you briefly have this. I say briefly only because it's as long as you're doing your project, as opposed to the duration of the whole model itself. But that I feel that's really interesting. Really interesting. When you were building the prediction model, was there a moment where it found something you wouldn't have predicted yourself? And I don't mean football results. What was that like? And does it compare in any way to the surprise and delight when you were producing creative jobs at Last Exit, for instance, or something?
I found that less quite. So so we're going to talk in terms of surprise then. So the code that I had, so everything was built in code, right?
Yeah.
And so I had a load of code that had taken months and months and months to write. And a lot of that code was fairly dull in terms of what it did. So
was that code that you had written by hand yourself, or was that code you had written with? Okay.
Yeah. No, that's code that I had written.
Yep.
So, that's fairly, it's fairly dry stuff. The majority of the code was to pull data from different sources and to get it into a rectangle. So a rectangle meaning that every column is how you would describe something, and every row is an observation. In the case of a prediction model, every row is a game, right? And every column is the way that you would describe that game. So it would be, the team, the home team, the away team, let's say form or whatever. So you reduce a description of that game down to columns. And so a lot of it was actually just getting the data, reasonably complicated data, into just a basic rectangle.
And how many columns did you have?
Oh gosh, sort of 50, 60 columns maybe.
Yep.
So quite a few. So then the speed at which it rewrote my code was quite astonishing. That was in a matter of hours. And that's something that's very easy to validate, because obviously you can see the output file. It's easy to interpret. You've got a whole bunch of games there, which it was still in. It wasn't in zeros and ones or anything like that. It was sort of text that you could see. But then going on to once you have that data, then the actual testing, then to say, well, okay, what data, what's the best format for some of these descriptor columns, and there's many different ways of doing that. So being able to test sort of 10, 20 different ways of doing that, that would have taken hours and hours and hours, and it had done previously, hours and days to do that. We arrived at a similar result in, again, just a few hours, having iterated maybe sort of 30, 40 times. And that's a back and forth process, but it's with AI that's rewriting the code with guardrails, so that that what it's doing is actually working, and then seeing the results come out. And then keeping track of that. So you've got all different ways of describing describing what's known as the feature in machine learning, which is the column, right? So composing new features, and then looking at the output in terms of, is that any more accurate? Because obviously we were using test data for prediction. So if we had 1,000 games, then we would use 800 to train the model, and then 200 to test against all historic games.
Yep.
And just the only way to understand how best to tune that model, compose the parameters, the actual machine learning sort of model that you use as well, is to iterate. So that's the only way to do it. And the speed of that iteration was, it was just 10, 20 times faster than doing that by hand. That's remarkable. So doing that, and part of the reason why I did that was not necessarily to launch a product. It was for me, for code that I understood really well, data that I understood well, and is easy to understand in terms of football games. And it's very easy to understand the results as well. So because it's like win, lose or draw. And that really showed at that point. I think the surprise in was to understand how quickly it would do it, and how well that it would do it as well. Along with some other downsides, which were that it would try statistical models or other things that didn't work, and then you'd have to say, "Are you sure you want to do this? We tried this 4 times. We don't seem to be getting anywhere. What are our options at this point?" So did notice some tendency to go down rabbit holes that perhaps weren't going to work. But nonetheless, still it showed me the potential for doing things at tremendous speed in code.
I was going to then ask you, do you think of what the model did as being creative, or as pattern finding, optimization, and by the sounds of it, the number of times you iterated, it does sound like it's really more pattern finding and optimization. But nonetheless, within there, were there moments where you were like, "Wow, I didn't expect you to make that jump and move us to there," I knew it was going to take some steps, but I didn't think you'd make a jump that was that big.
I think I was more easily impressed at that point because I'd gone back to that data set and to that code simply because I wanted to understand how it would work on that. So I think I'd agree with you that this was more iterative, so it was less. There was less sort of surprise baked into. Let's create anything that I would class as creativity on this. I think, however, what I would say is that obviously from when we've known each other before, we had a team of developers that would work for me.
Yes.
And communicating with developers is a tricky skill, right? And it's something that's tricky and it's challenging.
Yes.
I think I've not really thought about that until now. And one of the big things is that it's far easier to. So I think for me, it's a lot easier to communicate to something like Claude Code or Codex or Cursor, just because I think it's already baked into me to how to communicate to developers, whether that's a developer that's an LLM or whether it's a developer who's actually a human.
Yeah.
Because that's not necessarily easy. So because plenty of times you'll brief a developer, a human developer, and you think you've done it well, and the first checkpoint they've completely gone down the wrong path or misunderstood it, even though it was particularly clear. That happens a lot. Or something's buried in there that you didn't ask them, taking shortcuts. But I would still say it was there's the way that it interprets and understands what you're asking for is in a very deep sense, and usually that's more often right than wrong. Where it might go wrong is in terms of the execution, but not that often, but it might go wrong there. Yeah. But in terms of interpreting what you want, that's actually kind of the easy bit, which typically has been the more difficult thing with developers in the past. Now, excuse me. I would say in terms of something that's pushing towards creativity, I would say that the presentation that I described earlier was more towards that than necessarily the example with the football prediction model.
Right, that makes sense. Another question. Is there something you understand from having built these systems about what they structurally, an LLM, let's say really, what an LLM structurally can't do? Not won't do, but can't do. Where does it sort of run out of a juice in terms of its thinking?
I'm not sure I've actually reached that point. I don't know whether I've been using them enough to know that. I think I've been quite late into this. I think in terms of using it for some fairly advanced things in terms of reporting, whatever. So I feel like I've been quite late to that. So the models that I've been using, so for instance, Record is the later sort of Sonnet models to now the sort of Series 5 Opus models, which is what I tend to use at the moment. Fable's, I think, too high price for the sort of the advantage that it gives. And similarly with the equivalent models in ChatGPT. So I feel like coming late into that with these more advanced models, I've not necessarily felt the edges of that. I'm trying to think I see that some of the failings that I've run into are. My immediate thought is: have I given a good enough specification? Have I told the AI to put enough into memory around sort of the style that I want and some of the guardrails that I want? So to me, I always think that maybe it's a failure prompting as opposed to a failure within the model itself.
Right.
So I can't remember where I thought, okay, I've reached the edge of this. I think I've maybe had one conversation with it where I've thought that it seems to be getting tired, which I know is a
wow. That's a fascinating observation.
Yeah, so it was that's what occurred to me, and that could have just been because I was tired as well. But so because I've been deliberately trying not to anthropomorphize anything, but yeah, there was one instance, and I think that was fairly early on, where I thought this doesn't seem to be doing particularly well here. And I don't know whether it was because there was too much context, whether the context window was too cluttered. I don't know is the answer to that. And it was very early on, so I can't remember the example. But since then, and I think it's because I've been using the latest models, because I think I was reasonably sort of late to it for using advanced models. So I've only really been doing sort of fairly what I would consider to be reasonably advanced stuff in the last sort of, I would say, sort of 4 to 6 months.
Got it. And on the a note to that, I do find myself always saying please and thank you to it.
So do I. I saw a cartoon where the robots are taking over the world, and he said, "No, not this one," pointing at a human. He goes, he used to say please and thank you. So I still do that. It's just superstition. So.
Same. Okay, I'm going to move now to a bit of an abstraction to take this further, and to give it my context, I was listening to The Rest is Science the other day, and they were talking about music and how when we hear a tone, it's not really a tone, in the same way that we only need 20 frames a second to see continuous motion. You know, we only need X number of percussive strikes, if you will, to hit a continuous, to make it sound like a continuous tone. And while that works for us, if we were to come across aliens or maybe dolphins or dogs that we could communicate with, and we'd written some music for them and we could communicate about it, might they look at us and go, well, what on earth is this? This isn't pleasing. This just sounds like a lot of percussive strikes. Why, how come they haven't figured out how to do tones? And so I turned that thinking to working with an LLM. And while you're working with it with code, which could be construed as its native language or akin to it anyway, certainly, I was just wondering whether it was worth thinking about the idea that if I could get a model to make stuff for another model, what would it be that a model might find pleasing or interesting, and cause it to maybe have a discourse back and forth that was a little more genuine and closer to its soul, perhaps, than me putting in incredibly human things. And so I wondered what you might think of that, other than it's complete nonsense.
I really don't know. I think I still think of AIs as being very advanced statistical models.
Yeah.
So I think in mathematical terms, I think they're known as sort of curve-fitting machines, right?
Yeah.
So it's still all about it's regression. It's effectively regression in multiple dimensions. And if it goes beyond that, well, I think the problem is we don't understand enough about how human sort of reasoning and consciousness works. What we do know is that to some degree we are tremendously different from statistical models, right? We're not curve-fitting devices, although we do some of that. We're not particularly good at that. So to layer on sort of human emotions, maybe that's the right thing to do, right? Mm-hmm. At some point. Or I just don't think that we know enough around that. So, I mean, we don't even talk about the Turing test now because we're so far beyond that, because, there was something that was built to, I think that was built to deliberately fool us beyond that. So that was the first sort of thing to pass, and we don't even talk about it. But I think when we're getting into things like emotions and those sorts of things, which aren't, I just don't think anybody, well, I don't think, maybe the people who are, at OpenAI or Anthropic know about this, but certainly, I don't know. And I think we've got to be careful layering on, anthropomorphizing these things too much, because we're not even close to understanding why we feel these emotions, never mind, if something which has been designed as a statistical model sort of feels that. So whatever's pleasing to it, I don't know. That's a very, very hard and philosophical definition. So I don't know. Don't know about that. So I'm not even considered that.
Fair enough. No, that's fair.
What I would add to that is, although and again, you just don't know whether this is this is just a presentation layer to it, is that Claude especially does seem eager to please, right? So it's always with and ChatGPT does this as well. It's always with the follow-up, which is like, I've done this great thing for you, should we do A, B, or C? And it's like a very sort of jauntiness, very sort of jocular, sort of an eagerness to sort of please. But that's, to what degree is that programming?
Well,
the other issue is,
go on.
But the other issue is as well, we don't know what goes on inside the black box. So we fundamentally do not know, right? So these are inherently black boxes. So a lot of the improvements in the models, again, are iterative. And they're through iteration. So it's about more sort of horsepower to the engine. And then the fine-tuning of those is iterative. So what actually goes on in the black box, the trillions and trillions of machine learning calculations that happen, those can't be unpicked. So is there something that resembles emotion that's within it? I don't know how we would even go about finding that out. Anyway.
That was interesting what you were saying a couple of minutes ago, because I'm thinking 18 months ago, I did a piece where I would just come up with absurd ideas and say, hey, Gemini, how about if instead of Walker's crisps, instead of calling them flavors, they call them things like, I'm happy today, I'm sad today, I'm down today, I'm, this. And then, when I go and meet with a friend, however I'm feeling, I could, pull that bag of crisps out and, share them with that person. And a whole bunch of just utter nonsense like that. And every time Gemini would come back and go, that's a fantastic idea. That's a great idea. Goodness, that does this, 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 and this. And it would be just very encouraging and positive about whatever I said. And more recently, it's to the point where one afternoon I sat down and wrote about 20 of those in a row. And when I stood up, I thought, wow, I've got to be one of the smartest people in the world. It's just again and again and again, it thinks it's a great idea. And, and had to be reminded that, no, you deliberately done this because you knew what it was going to do. And more recently, I found that it doesn't do that anymore, but it, as you say, it always comes back with a suggestion for how you can continue the conversation that you're having, that instance. And why is that? Because they want you to use more of it? They want you to stay there?
Yeah, I think that's a feature, because if you were to boil down the business model of all of them is usage, right?
Yep.
So to get to have more usage, then you need to be more useful, and I guess people need to be prompted towards that. So I don't think I think that's a feature. So I think that's definitely a feature that they've baked in, so that there's a follow up, so that you can continue. And if you can get, having worked in advertising, if you said, hey, this one feature is going to mean that usage will go up by 20%, and you're like, wow, that's a killer feature. Right? I've just got people to use 20% more just through this one feature, which is asking a follow-up question.
Yep.
So I think that's just baked in.
Yeah, for the moment, I feel like things change, and the way, just over the last 3 years, I feel the way that using it, the experience has changed again and again and again and again, and quite radically. If you do any form of iteration, if you do anything more than ask a simple question, the back and forth and stuff is a very different experience, and is not almost constantly changing, I think. Anyway, Paul. Hello?
Yes, I'm here.
All right. I was going to say thank you. That was super, super useful, really helpful, and I got some really interesting stuff from that. Really interesting. Thank you.
Excellent. Very welcome.